Welcome back to Fraud Files. My name is Simon, and I'm the interviewer on this podcast, which brings you real-life case files and forensic insights into a number of white-collar frauds, financial crimes, and misdemeanors that your host Edward has personally encountered, and in some cases brought to light during his financial, corporate, and business career. He shines the spotlight on both the frauds and the perpetrators. In this episode, entitled White Collar, Brass Neck. A brass neck is a British phrase for supreme confidence, audacity, or shamelessness, describing someone who acts brazenly without feeling shame, even when their behaviour is unacceptable. It describes someone with immense cheek or verve, often taking crazy risks. So, Edward, have you come across some white-collar, brass neck frauds in your time as an accountant?
Yes, Simon, white-collar fraud tends to be opportunistic. But when that opportunity presents itself, often the actual packaging of the fraud, the mechanics of the fraud, are relatively straightforward. And during my career, a number of the frauds I've seen amaze me, because really it's like the sheer audacity of the employee who's committing the offence. And they're defrauding the company, and often the manner in which they do that is really quite it's quite simple. It's not a convoluted, elaborate fraud. Often it's very simple, and because the opportunity has presented itself, the employee just goes for it, type of thing. You know, if they see the opportunity and they have it in their makeup to enrich themselves, they just do it, and they don't often think about creating a complex layer or web of deceit. And as I'm going to explain in some of the examples I'm going to give shortly, you'll see how it's brazen.
So does white-collar fraud always take place on the premises, or can it take place off-site?
Yes, I mean, there's no defining attribute of a fraud as to whether it's conducted in plain sight or if it happens at a remote location off-site. Typically, the head office is where the accounting function resides in a company. But I've seen frauds in the head office, and I've seen them committed remotely.
Can you explain what you mean by remotely?
Sure. In terms of the remote frauds, I think that the audacious play happens, just out of reach in a remote satellite office or off-site location. So you've got companies that provide goods and services. They have multiple offices, or they might have service centers, depending on the type of business, where clients interact with the company. I think the psychology is fascinating, because when a fraudster is miles away from the head office, the brass neck really comes into play. Perpetrator relies on a distance delusion, the idea they have that if you can't see me, you can't spot my crime. And often they'll remain cool, calm, and collected on the other end when they're reporting with head office, dealing with the accountants back at base. And they've mastered the art of the remote smokescreen. And they use the physical gap between the service being performed and the office paying the bill as a playground for deception. So often they're just filing fake invoices or skimming off the top, but they're betting on the hesitation, lack of procedures, lack of internal controls back at head office. And they're also betting that people aren't going to travel out, people from head office aren't going to travel out to their location, ask them questions, sniff around the place. So they've sort of deluded themselves, if you like, that they're safe in carrying out the fraud, and that the gap is too large to be found out. But of course, they might be out of sight, but it doesn't mean they're out of reach, because eventually the audit trail catches up with them.
So can you put meat on the bones for us about some of the brazen white-collar frauds you encountered?
Yes, so in one particular instance that I came across when I was working as an accountant in senior finance for a company, the fraud was perpetrated by an employee who had a position of authority at that remote location. And they were submitting invoices back to head office for payment for goods and services that were being consumed at that remote location. And what they did was very simple. They just created dummy invoices for goods and services that didn't exist, that weren't supplied to the company. They created some false companies. So they had the letterhead, they had the paperwork looking good, providing a service, often then difficult to track and to verify back at head office because the remote location is far away. And of course, they're submitting on a regular basis invoices for approval. And back at head office, the accounts payable function typically is under a lot of pressure in growing companies. There's lots of bills being paid, and often there could be multiple remote locations. So any one particular remote location is just forming part of a processing train that's taking place. And invoices are being essentially collated by the accounts payable clerk, and they give it a look over where they might seek out some evidence, but often not a lot of evidence that the goods and services were actually supplied. That information is then typically passed to a senior accountant to press the button on the payment. And the payment then is made by bank transfer to the account details that are given on the invoice. And once the perpetrators got away with it, then they can start to replicate it with the same company providing the same service, or create some new companies from time to time just to keep the fraud moving. But really, it's very straightforward. There isn't a lot of thought goes into it. And I really think the brass neck of it all is, how do these people think they're going to get away with it? And in this particular case, the individual was found out and criminal charges were brought against him. In another case, I came across a situation where an individual was using her own bank account, her personal bank account, to flow monies through. So instead of using the divisional bank account associated with the off-site location, they were using their own bank account to collect revenues from the services being provided at that off-site location, and then actually making payments out from their own bank account to discharge fictitious goods and services that were never being supplied. So you have a situation where there was legitimate expenditure that was flowing through the divisional bank account. So that was being processed through head office in the normal manner. But then there was this whole other chunk of revenue and expenses that the individual was not declaring back at head office. This situation went on for a while, and it was in place by the time I arrived at the company. And my job was then to investigate what was going on. That was my brief in this case. And the individual who perpetrated the fraud, certainly in the explanations and reasoning that was provided to me as to why they had conducted themselves in this particular manner of using a personal bank account, they had said that that had been approved previously, and it was in order to facilitate very local payments that were being made for services, and it was just a facilitation of the operation rather than things having to flow back through head office. And I got very elaborate explanations, very long-winded justifications as to why this had happened, and how as to why everything had been accounted for correctly. But when I delved into it, when I went to look at the actual goods and services, I mean, I could see that there was something untoward that wasn't right about it. Clearly, the individual was taking goods from the company, having them delivered to her home address, and making out that those goods had been provided. Goods and equipment had been provided to the off-site location for the company's use, but actually it was for her personal use, and so they were putting through those type of expenditures were going through, and in some cases there was no supporting documentation available to support this sort of second set of books that this individual had been maintaining. So you had the revenues coming in, and in some cases you could see when the information was provided by the individual, you could see that they were putting personal money into the bank account to keep the system going. And then they try to justify as to why they did that, because they said, we don't have to bother head office. I'm putting my money in. And of course, ultimately, they got that money back from the revenues. So it was like teaming and lading. And it was just getting over timing differences in order to keep those services and the whole scheme going. So it was a bit bizarre, and the investigations continued, and more suspicions were aroused. And again, just the ultimate brass neck, I would have to say, in that particular case. The third example I'm going to give of a fraud that took place outside of the head office building was when I was working as an accountant for a property rental company. So they were renting out accommodation in the residential sector, and they had, in this particular case, the company had an external agent who was assisting them with the properties, helping them to find tenants, helping them to make sure everything was sorted for the occupancy, and actually facilitating and collecting the rents to some extent as well from the tenants. So while some rents were paid directly by bank transfers from tenants, over a period of time, let's say over a period of years even, it seemed that this agent was saying that the monies were being paid to him directly, and that this was something that was sort of facilitating the arrangements for the tenants. And what the agent, once he had his foot in the door and was actually collecting rents from a number of the tenants, well, that's when the opportunistic situation arose and presented itself, because what the individual started to do was siphon off money because it was outside of the head office. He was an external agent, and there was a lack of checks and balances and a lack of verification. And I think he would have sniffed that out. That's what they do. They test the water. They see where the weaknesses might be that they could then expose. You got a small business environment. You got a busy management team. They take their eye off the ball. And the third parties, like this particular property agent, they're then able to exploit the weaknesses. And you've got the rent, often in the form of cash, and the agent skimming off the top. When he was found out, and I was involved in the uncovering of his fraud, the excuses, the explanations, where they became more and more outrageous. And in this particular case, criminal proceedings were not taken against the individual, but clearly the service arrangement was obviously terminated immediately, and there was a parting of the ways. And again, it's brazen, and there was nothing clever about it. I uncovered it by one particular occasion, going to one of the properties to have a look at the property, to check out any dilapidations, and I happened to get speaking to the tenant there. And the agent had said that the tenant had left without giving notice. And when I turned up at the property, obviously the company had its own second set of keys. I turned up at the property just to have a look around and see it with another colleague. And the tenant happened to be there. And so the tenant had continued to pay rent to the agent. And the agent had said, the head office and to the accountant who was overseeing this whole area, that the individual had left and that the apartment was vacant. When of course it wasn't vacant, rent was still being paid, and basically the agent was pocketing the money. So if that's not brazen, I don't know what is.
Can you give our listeners some red flags to watch out for?
In terms of red flags, I think it's fair to say that once the fraud is taking place, because obviously prior to a fraud taking place, all you can do is make sure you've got the correct accounting procedures and internal controls in place. There's checks and balances in the system, and a good accounts department will have a setup and a structure that goes a long way to preventing fraud taking place. But, red flags, once the fraud is in play, and once I started to get a feeling that there might be something not right, when you confront, at that point, alleged perpetrator, I think when they start to give their explanations, that's when you really get to see the cracks early on. They will often state that there's something going on locally that you wouldn't understand. They might try and bamboozle a little bit, saying things operate a little differently, but everything's okay. And they try and obviously put your mind at ease very quickly. But the manner in which that is done can set alarm bells ringing, I think, and it's a reason not to stop asking questions, but actually to start digging a little bit deeper. I think where documentation is lacking, where invoices are consistently vague, or services that always seem to fall just outside of the standard. But maybe the biggest red flag of all is when an individual is approached, you get this defensive flare. You get a sudden aggressive reaction to a simple routine inquiry. And that aggression can come through with copious amounts of explanations and information and just way over the top and trying to swamp the whole fraud in a quagmire of paperwork and explanations. And then you can also get the other side of it, which is simply you get told to back off a little bit, if you like. A brass neck often uses offense as their best defense. But another situation where in another company that I worked for, believe it or not, another fraud or potential fraud, let's call it in this case, where I was an accountant on a temporary assignment, and it was within the head office. And whilst I was doing the job that I was supposed to be doing around the year-end closing of the accounts, dealing with the auditors and whatever, through that I started to get a feeling about something untoward going on in the IT department. This was a large company. There was a lot of throughput. There was a lot of computer equipment. A lot of IT monies the expenditure on IT was significant. And then I started to engage a little bit with the IT department and some of the individuals there in terms of asking questions, in terms of equipment and record keeping and invoicing. And I could see, the shutters sort of coming down. And I knew that certain bits of information and some of the purchasing processes and some of the control of inventory, so the control of equipment, was being obscured from me. I wasn't being allowed to investigate it properly. It was as if that they were too busy to deal with me, busy time of year, don't bother me now, go back and do whatever you're supposed to do, but don't bother me now. And I think they would have started to create waves for me in order to sort of scare me off a little bit. And I think they didn't like me prying into what probably had been a cozy little area for them for fraud. My sense became that equipment that was being purchased by the IT department for this very large company, that might have been iPhones, laptops, and so on and so forth, that the control over those purchases was lax in terms of which individuals, which employees were being provided with that equipment. In this company, a very modern company in terms of the manner in which it did business, all employees were provided with a company phone and a company iPad, company remote equipment, screens, etc., for access remotely. But anyway, there was a lot of money being spent and I couldn't see proper control. And when questions were asked, it was like, that employee lost their phone, so they had to get a replacement. But who was that employee, and did they really lose the phone, or was this just another manner in which the IT department, because it was happening on numerous occasions and numerous different approaches were being taken, and also the equipment would come back. So obviously phones become obsolete, equipment becomes obsolete or semi-obsolete, and newer versions of equipment are given out to employees. Well, what happened to the old equipment? And when you start getting stories that it was given away to charity or dumped because it had no realizable value, you knew that wasn't the case. You knew there was value. And it sort of came to my mind, and there was a point at which I stopped investigating that, and I was actually, in this particular case, I was removed from the company. Whether the IT department were part of that process, viewers can consider that themselves. But in this particular case, I felt that maybe some of the secondhand equipment that was coming back to the IT department was being sold off on other sites like eBay or elsewhere, and that the money was being pocketed by one individual, but it probably would needed collusion. So one or two individuals, high-ranking individuals in the IT department, I felt were not doing things correctly. So there you've got a blatant thing right under the head office, the IT department right next to the accounting department. Again, a busy accounting department, prioritizing other work streams, and therefore turning a blind eye from a company perspective was not a material amount of money, but from an individual, personal perspective, of course, these individuals were making significant additional amounts of money and lining their own pockets. And of course, if left unchecked, you then have to ask the question, it's opportunistic, and if left unchecked, how much more sophisticated would those frauds become? Frauds that start out small, they grow bigger and bigger once the perpetrator or perpetrators feel that they can get away with it. They have the brass neck. If they can do it, they will.
Can you sum up for our listeners about the interplay between brass necks and white-collar fraud?
In the final analysis, the white-collar brass neck is more than just an individual's audacity. It's a failure of the professional, business and accounting environments, and it thrives in the gap between what we are told and what we choose to verify. For those of us in the accounting and business community, we must realize that these frauds don't just deplete bank accounts, but they dismantle the very foundation of corporate trust. The individual operating from a remote site isn't just betting on your distance, they're betting on your professional complacency. They are counting on the fact that your desire to maintain a smooth relationship, not to rock the boat, will outweigh your duty to maintain rigorous oversight. And as we conclude, I leave you with this thought. The red flags are rarely invisible. They are usually just inconvenient. The brass neck relies on your willingness to look the other way for the sake of the status quo. But in our profession, silence isn't just a courtesy, it's a liability. The question isn't whether these frauds are happening, because of course they are. It's whether you have the professional courage to challenge the audacity of the person sitting across the screen from you, from a remote location, or sitting in the department right next to you in the head office building. I'm Edward, and this is Fraud Files. Let the audit trail lead where it may.